Welcome to Yo Today. I'm Paul Pepys, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Raoul Lievanos, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. He is an affiliated faculty member in the Departments of Environmental Studies and Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies. Professor Lievanos is also a research affiliate with the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology at the University of Washington. His interests include environment, health, and risk, urban sociology, race, ethnicity, and immigration, organizations and institutions, social movements, spatial pattern analysis and geographic information systems, historical narrative sociology, and qualitative methods. Thanks so much, Raoul, for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us. So tell us a little bit about your background.
In terms of my interests in sociology really stem from my background. That's something I share with my students a lot. This in spring quarter 2022, I was teaching social inequality, and that's something that is a kind of a lower division, entry level kind of class into thinking about power and inequality. Kind of emphasize how aspects of our social location and where we're situated in relation to others can influence how we see the world and the types of careers we pursue and interests we have. And so one thing I share with students, and they end up writing a paper, is kind of think about their pathways to the university. And much of what comes out of that kind of paper is they often emphasize, I ask them to kind of think about the kind of family and education experiences they had and how they're socialized, and where they get into having certain kind of value system, but also resource-based to kind of pursue things. And one thing that comes to light in sharing what I try to do with students is kind of give examples to share some of my background in that regard. And I think the things, that my interests, as you outline them, and I have a lot of interests, and so I appreciate you reading those all out. That really stems from really early kind of interest in questions of justice, and also being kind of multiracial background and thinking about early on about race. Like my parents and my dad's grew up in a working class Mexican American community in Tucson, Arizona. My mom, let's say middle upper class, kind of Northwestern European background in New England and California. And they come from two different worlds, and it was, growing up, it was really relevant for me, just very different kind of family experiences, and also kind of questions about belonging really came up a lot. And whether it be me being younger and kind of I always get the story of putting my kind of tan arm between my father's arm, who's much more darker complected, and versus my mom, who's more fairer skin, and just kind of thinking about, okay, where do I fit in this? And so that I had that kind of those experiences, the kind of ideas, reflections early on. And as I grew up, I got to grew up, started paying attention more to news in the 90s, and whether it be police brutality and seeing that Rodney King, and we're observing the early 90s in Los Angeles and elsewhere, and thinking about that, and kind of these questions posing my dad, who was a police officer for quite some time, but who was also working in a community that's been well documented. There's been sociologists that have spoken about Santa Maria, California, where I grew up, and the types of inequalities and how Mexican Americans are viewed there. And so he had an interesting positionality, I think, kind of being a police officer and both kind of being community oriented and solving kind of problems within the community, but also working with the Mexican American population that was often being, one could argue, kind of over policed. And so it's kind of, those kind of questions, talking with him and okay, well, I also remember you telling me, Dad, about being the Chicano movement in college, right? So how do you square it? So those kind of questions we had a lot, and my mom's side as well. Her dad was a Unitarian minister who really emphasized civil rights, and there's family stories about him marching civil rights movements, protests, and those kind of things. And my grandma, my mom's mom, being interested in that. My mom really interested in women's rights, and so it just kind of those discussions were really relevant for me. And I think as I kind of had that background, I also really like sports, and I was a very active kid. And so I played a lot of baseball all the way through college. And I think there's a recent story in the around the UO that kind of talk more about that. But I had my pathway kind of take me through community college first, which that was again baseball related because I had wanted to go to some universities and gotten into some out of high school, but went to the community college route, and that was again for me to kind of develop more my baseball skills. But because I was kind of thin, short catchers weren't as sought after by scouts, and so I was kind of told to kind of go and develop and grow more. But at the same time, I grew, I think, in terms of thinking more about sociology. And so we didn't, we had social sciences and or social studies and history and economics and political science and those kind of things in government in high school. But I started taking sociology classes, and that really resonated with kind of critical perspectives on the world and inequalities and privilege as well, and race and kind of questions about community and belonging. And so that I really enjoyed those classes, and then went on to transfer to Fresno State. And I shared again with my undergraduate students that I work with a lot here of folks who are kind of trying to figure out their pathway, and how things that you might encounter in sociology will resonate with you, and you may not know that kind of that might be the case. And I literally, with an academic advisor, I was sitting in the student athlete office at Fresno State, and my econ and government kind of business classes that I'd taken wouldn't transfer. And so I to be eligible, I needed to pick another social science degree pathway. And I literally closed my eyes and landed on sociology, and I'm glad that I did. It's kind of funny that happened. And I was like, yeah, I've taken classes in that, and I enjoyed those. Like, okay, let's do that. And so, and I hear this here at the UO as well amongst some of the athletes of, they go into sociology because the classes transfer or, or whatever that might be. And it just felt kind of like I felt very fortunate that I landed that way that one day in the office, and I loved it. And being in Fresno, I got to see a lot more. I had fantastic undergraduate professors there who had us go on assignments of kind of visualizing social inequalities and kind of looking at neighborhoods and disparities between different parts of the city. And that got me thinking spatially, and how privileges and disadvantages are really reflected in the landscape quite literally, and in the process then can further kind of shape experiences of social inequality and privilege. And so that was eye-opening. And so I was playing there and at Fresno, and I had walked on, and so I was not on scholarship, and but I had walked on and earned the starting position as a catcher. And a week or so before the season was supposed to start, I shattered my thumb and on my throwing hand, and I was at like probably the best I had ever, like I was playing, and I had some scouts that were interested in talking with, giving me suggestions, and I was kind of heard also through the grapevine that I had been on some lists. And then once that happened, I just kind of wasn't the same after that. It took a long time to recover. I sat out that season, but and then I came back and played it sparingly the next couple of years. But that moment, is kind of we have those in our life where things fundamentally change. And I just went with, what was really of interest to me at that time with sociology. And being in the Central Valley of California, there's a lot of, in San Joaquin Valley in particular, there's a lot of work around air quality and environmental health issues. And so with my and things I kind of took for granted actually when I grew up on the central coast of California, where there was concerns about pesticides and farm worker communities kind of experiencing environmental health problems, but that hadn't been on the radar as much. Though I was concerned about farm workers, and that kind of overlaps some with my father's family background and everything. But being in the Central Valley in San Joaquin, we'd go to we'd give some baseball clinics and those kind of things, or dress up in our uniform. And I remember going to the Children's Hospital in Madera, which it's one of the it's a very prominent and it's an important hospital in providing care and respiratory for respiratory illnesses and other kind of illnesses for youth. And just seeing kids who look like me or more darker complected, but also across the kind of racial spectrum, just hooked up to respirators and those kind of things. And, the things that kind of gave them hope were seeing us in uniforms, but for us, it was like seeing them persevering was gave us hope. And so I think that changed me a lot. And while I still like baseball a lot, and coaching my son's first grade baseball team, I think those kind of very real material kind of inequalities and threats to livelihoods, I think, and as they relate to social inequalities, just really resonated. And so I ended up pursuing that further. And baseball didn't work out, but I went on to graduate school at UC Davis, and so that was kind of but I always go back to that point at Fresno. A lot of stuff, things just crystallized and kind of life-changing moments. And I think that was the really important experience and kind of set me on to where I am now.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting story. I love the way that chance, or maybe it's destiny, played a role in where you ended up. But so you, you've already started to make clear, you are an environmental sociologist. So first of all, how do you understand what it means to be an environmental sociologist? What's significant about that field? What's important about that field?
Yeah, as a sociologist first, so kind of the putting sociology in it first is really a concern about kind of our group memberships and how to some extent, we have some agency in our identities that we can construct, but oftentimes they're constructed by others, right? We were born into this world, and we have this whole other kind of ways of relating to each other that already predate us, and we get socialized into that. And I think as kind of sharing my own background, but in that, having that perspective as sociologists, then we think that, okay, well, the types of groups that we're connected to, both as we define ourselves and others define us, right, really shapes then our experiences of opportunities and constraints, and in a number of institutional contexts. And so I've focused a lot of that, and I really kind of, thinking about what is an institution, right, kind of these established rules and patterns of practice, right, that we follow, and in a number of different contexts, whether it be government or political sphere or economics or science or medicine, right, and in all those institutional contexts, education system, law, right, that they really they provide these templates for how different groups are seen and the types of advantages or disadvantages that they get. And so that's kind of some basic premises within sociology. And then you think about the environment then, and these really great, Alan Schneeber is a fantastic, unfortunately not with us anymore, but environmental sociologist who many have cited in terms of, a question, kind of thinking about inequalities, right? And so I'm going to paraphrase, but this standard quote of, right, the environment is kind of out there. It's, there's questions about, protecting the environment, but given, where we are in our kind of our status and our kind of the group memberships we have often shape our experiences of the environment, right? And he says it more eloquently than that, but so you have that aspect of kind of, right, you can't really point to the environment as protected, right? It's a question about for whom and for what, I think is actually more closer to the quote he's is attributed to him, and folks like David Pello and other folks who and Julie Z and other faculty I had at UC Davis, I think have really been influential, along with Robert Bullard and Dorceta Taylor and other sociologists who have been really influential within and both kind of looking at those types of inequalities in our experience in the environment and different types of political agency and resources that are channeled into particular types of environmentalisms that then also reflect these inequalities, right? And so it's really a question about power and inequality, and for whom and for what is the environment protected, are really kind of questions I have, and that goes very much often goes back to, right, just thinking about those experiences in Madera and saying, okay, these kids on the respiratory, hooked up to kind of respiratory support, and it's like thinking about the San Joaquin Valley and those kind of things, or even my where my dad grew up in, very working class Mexican American Tucson, of the types of occupational health hazards near their community, and mining pollution and that kind of stuff, and so that's really what I'm concerned. For whom and for what is the environment protected? Who has authority over environmental policy making? And I was fortunate to really have some fantastic mentors at Davis that really helped me kind of pursue those questions.
So let's talk about a specific case that you've worked on. So you've written about the water crises in Flint, Michigan, and in the San Joaquin Valley.
Mm-hmm.
So why was it good to compare those two cases, and what did you find? What were some of the findings through that comparison?
Yeah, and so that's so my kind of the broader and very abstract kind of theoretical questions I'm interested in is questions about risk and threats, right, and how they're unequally distributed, and the spatial dimensions of that, right. And so in part of that was an opportunity to connect kind of research I had done on the Flint water crisis, that there's so many others who are in Flint and in Michigan, both I have colleagues there and others who I've read their work that are just doing fantastic community engaged work. Jennifer Carrera, Michael Mascarenhas, so many folks that are really there with the people. And part of that project we're doing with Flint, with Claire Rosenfeld Evans and Ryan Light in our department, were to kind of apply some kind of techniques that I've been doing in spatial analysis, along with think about intersectionality, right? Of so that we have kind of taking a step back there with the Flint water crisis, right? We get a lot of reports about and academic and also in the public sphere, and there's legal cases and all that's brought all this to light of just how much systemic racism against Flint, being a predominantly Black city and also low income, really contributed to the crisis and how folks were perceived, and the extent of supports that they were given and not given, right, and contributing to the pollution of the water there and the illnesses that resulted. But one of the questions that, in looking at all these other kind of analyses of, that we're finding, right, kind of disparate studies, that, well, it's also a story about single parent families, and single parent families are predominantly mother headed, right, and female headed households within that. So that brings the question then about, okay, well, race seems to matter, obviously, and then these other kind of studies are looking at family structure and gender, and so we wanted to explore that, and we had some other kind of aspects of our study that didn't pan out. We wanted to look more about into kind of the media response and how social media was used, or the extent to which it could be used to kind of understand kind of emergent environmental health threats. And that got complicated by using Twitter and how that could be. So we went this route, and we ended up finding at a very small scale of analysis at the block level that major predictor of that blocks would be exposed to lead service lines was the extent of single parent or single father Black families and single mother Latina families, which really doesn't, right? And so that was, you don't see that in the headlines, you don't see that in a lot of the conversation, but it gets into, kind of what I think sociologists, I'm hoping, can offer is to kind of, okay, how do we think about these kind of intersecting kind of inequalities, and how do they manifest spatially, and how does that translate into our unequal experience of the environment? And so from there, one of my mentors, who I still collaborate with, Julie Z, she and I kind of picked up on some of that, those insights, and thought more historically, and it was for this edited volume, which I actually have right here, Urban Emergency Mismanagement, right, and the Crisis of Neoliberalism. So we had an opportunity to contribute to that book, and I had been doing this work on Stockton, and Julie has been continuing to do work on the Central Valley that I collaborated with her in graduate school, and so we had this opportunity to kind of think about the comparison. And with the Stockton case, there had been as we're seeing in the headlines right now, if you've been looking at some of the just the current drought in California, particularly within San Joaquin Valley. So Stockton's at the northern portion of the San Joaquin Valley, and it stretches all the way down to Bakersfield. And so there's a lot of rural communities who their water systems are drying up. They're having to get bottled water from the stores, and right. And so there's these kind of, it's interesting when we have these kind of disasters, similarly with Katrina and other kind of disasters, Flint being one, there's these, it becomes a reference category, right? Of, okay, we're experiencing this water crisis. Is it like Flint? And you see that in a number of cases. Hurricane Katrina, disasters, flooding, is it like New Orleans? And so we kind of use that as an opportunity to just look at what had been going on in Stockton about water privatization, kind of water infrastructure, and there had been concerns about privatizing that water there, what the implications would be for water provision and water quality. And one thing we ended up finding out is that some of the kind of concerns about poor water quality were actually kind of being concentrated more in the privileged areas of Stockton. And so we kind of use that case study, and kind of zooming out in the Flint case to just look more at race and class kind of inequalities, and how neighborhoods were developed and then exposed to elevated water lead levels and blood lead levels that others had detected, to kind of think through, okay, how do these kind of risks around water and water kind of quality, how do they unfold unevenly across different cities, and how does that relate to how those cities are racially segregated, uneven developed, right, and how there's these kind of unequal patterns of capital investment within neighborhoods, and going back decades, back to pretty much the kind of common point was around the 1930s, following the Great Depression, where New Deal legislation was put in that really started to standardize real estate appraisal and federal mortgage insurance, right? That then contributed to redlining, things that have been documented. And so that's kind of our starting point for those cases. So we start from that kind of disaster context, right? I mean, Great Depression, we can conceptualize that as a disaster, and then think then about how subsequent phases of urban development went through these periods of crises, and then a decreasing investment from the state, and an increasing turn to private mechanisms, market mechanisms, voluntary incentives, and those kind of things, and corporate kind of provision of water services and those kind of things that are critiqued for not necessarily being about maybe the bottom line, right, is perhaps a little different than environmental health and protection and social justice, right? There's also profit motive involved, and so and also a different kind of configuration of kind of responsibilities by state agencies and municipalities and private entities. And so we just tracked that, and what we found is kind of a complex story of how kind of patterns that were of unequal capital investment that were very much racially biased, right, ended up concentrating hazards within Flint amongst low-income communities of color. But in the Stockton case, it actually kind of had this unexpected boomerang effect of a disadvantaged, segregated South Side getting a lot of other threats to their livelihood and well-being throughout their history. But then in this context of water privatization, much of actually the threat of poor water quality was then being distributed to a more privileged part of the city in the North End. And so it's kind of a way to kind of compare and kind of think about complexity and some of these outcomes. And right, how this broader problem about how we or how environmental health protections and social services are distributed, and perhaps like what is it, what, you know, when we see an increasing turn towards private provision and privatized services, is it what people say, the proponents of it? Is it really going to contribute to more efficient distribution of services, or right, or is it going to have these other outcomes that are not desirable and they're also unequal, which then contributes as, and I've been working on Stockton for quite a while back to my dissertation, and so one thing kind of finding in that the Flint case, right, is that those exacerbation of inequalities then also are contributing to a breakdown of community to some extent, right, between groups, divisions, and in a context where so much of our country is very divided, these kind of questions help us to kind of think through, I think, some of those concerns that are constantly pressing for us. So it's kind of a meandering response to that, but that, you know, that's kind of how we got to that study and some key insights that we had.
So it was extremely interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about your work on Stockton. And you mentioned, as in the previous answer, you know, my sense is, I mean, you mentioned intersectionality, the intersectional quality of your approach, and in the case of the water crises, your results complicated a kind of older model of the way inequality has been thought about in the United States, which is really around the black white binary.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you've studied, and you mentioned it in passing, was what redlining looked like in Stockton, which is entirely different than it looks like in, you know, in an East Coast black white kind of example. So tell us a little bit about your findings. You've already begun to talk about your findings about the history of redlining in Stockton, and how that complicates this black white binary, and any other key findings that you found in that.
Yeah, I mean, that really, and again, I just, it's funny, these kind of the origins of some of these works really do stem from really great mentoring I had. So, you know, now and faculty that we've had here or who were here at one point. So, and kind of thinking about this kind of think about it as a relational approach. And so, to looking at race and racial inequalities and the intersecting inequalities. And that's really, you know, Dan Hosang Martinez, who was here, now left to Yale. He was someone who, when I came here in 2016, my first tenure track position was at Washington State University. And Dan really, you know, I had shared some of my dissertation work, and, you know, he just reached out and we're talking about it. And he's also someone who worked with Laura Polito from when he was in grad school. And now we have Laura Polito here. And I think with the two of them, I've both benefited from reading Laura's work, who has really kind of helped to bring this kind of spatial thinking to racial inequalities. And when we think about space, right, it's relational, right? Of, you hear real estate agents, right? Location, location, locational. It's all location of this place in relation to others, right? And so I think, so when we study those kind of inequalities, inherently about relations and reference groups and reference spaces. And so I really took those insights, you know, and I really benefited from conversations with both Dan and Laura about that. And then, of course, reading their work. But through talking with Dan, then I got to kind of participate in another edited volume that helped me kind of look back at my dissertation data that I went back all the way to the late 1800s to think about the development of Stockton and how hierarchies were starting to get established through different waves of immigration and a very diverse setting that necessitates thinking about all these different racial and ethnic groups that are coming into, you know, a West Coast port city like that. And so, you know, of reading that history of looking at, okay, the experience of indigenous folks there, to Chinese, you know, strong anti-Chinese sentiment, right, in California, and exploitation, and looking at the Japanese experience during World War II, and then thinking, you know, through that context, then a continuous and kind of back and forth kind of power dynamic with Mexican Americans within Stockton and more increasingly more South and Central Americans against a very diverse white ethnic population within there and hierarchies within it. And so of just reading that history, and this is one thing I think sociologists will really focus on is, or at least we have I think, work that I've seen, and I think we definitely have a strong approach to this here in our department, is to really stay close to the data and okay, we have this history necessitates, right, thinking outside a black-white paradigm that could apply in Midwest cities, East Coast cities to some extent, history. And so in looking at the Stockton case and looking at redlining there, I kind of use that as a case study, kind of think through this conceptually, but then also this other story about redlining, right? That it was following the Great Depression in the 1930s, that it was predominantly Black neighborhoods, but also Jewish neighborhoods that has been documented, right? Were right, denied, I should say the neighborhoods that are predominantly Black or Jewish or low income, right, were denied, had higher mortgage loan denial rates. And that they were redlined and they were seen as hazardous, right? And the Stockton case kind of helps, right, kind of think then about, okay, well, so that's part of the story, but then the way that neighborhood appraisals were developing at that time, that there was this yellow category and a blue and a green that reflected how neighborhoods were being graded in relation to their investment worthiness that was seen by federal underwriters, the homeowners loan corporation, I should say, who were actually trained by sociologists. And so, and when I talk about this in my urban class, right, it's kind of this reflexive approach on sociology as well, right? That these really discriminatory appraisals came from really dominant kind of urban ecological thinking in sociology, questions about neighborhood decline, invasion and succession, discourse we still hear today, where wrapped up around the immigration debate and conspiracy theories and things. So these things aren't new by any means that we're seeing today. But in this context, right, of kind of the state becoming increasingly right, concerned about protecting their the mortgages that they're underwriting, right? Now that at that time, that's where the 30-year fixed interest loan comes from. Is that then they established this very technical, I should say systematic approach to grading neighborhood investment risk. And so again, going back to this idea of risk and how that's just shaped and structures our housing markets and notions of worthiness and desirability. But in the Stockton case, kind of one thing I found is, yes, strong anti-Black racism really influenced how neighborhoods were downgraded and seen as most hazardous or redlined. But then there's a gradation from still declining, which is, or I should say declining, which is the yellow category that was given, to blue, which is still desirable. They would talk about it as like the 1935 Oldsmobile in the appraisals, versus the green neighborhoods that were the elite and the first grade. And their gradation in the real estate market really reflected also racial hierarchies that we have a national, at that time, strong anti-Black racism throughout all of real estate. And you see in all these case studies, but then that gets fitted locally depending on the established hierarchies there. And that's something that Laura Polito really wrote a lot about, right? How that national racial narrative fits to the local. And there's particularities. So the Stockton one, it's very diverse and it fits onto this, racial hierarchy that was very much predicated on indigenous erasure, but also marginalization of Chinese, particularly at that time period, and then but also around Mexican Americans and even Italians were kind of seen as an investment threat. And that speaks to Southeast Europeans were also, right, their experience of inequalities and segregation at that time, and then Jewish folks as well, and Arab immigrants within the area. But that defining line, it was really that strong anti-Black racism, but that we can't understand that without knowing how that anti-Black racism was inscribed and institutionalized in those neighborhood appraisals without seeing how it was happened quite literally, and saying, okay, this place isn't as bad, or isn't as risky as this other one because they have a more desirable racial group, or and then they look at how that intersected often with class, and they talk about laborers versus capitalists. And so one thing that's kind of interesting in looking back on that now is some kind of models of neighborhood investment patterns that we still see today, where in the Stockton case, the places that were green and most highly invested in were those around the University and the University of the Pacific. And there's racially restrictive covenants that were put in place to make sure that people of color could not own the land there. And that helped to then reinforce that exclusivity. And so when, looking around and, talking to the students and just being reflexive around the UO and just other universities, I've seen this in Philadelphia, lectured at Drexel University and on my doctorate, I was working on my doctorate of, there's important questions about the type of development we see in university towns where, what's going on around the university and how that might impact the community. And I haven't explored that systematically here, but it's hard not to notice. And the students definitely notice it, right? And they're thinking about their rents and everything. And so, yeah, so that's kind of what I've found in the Stockton case. And then those grades became very influential. And as I'm working on and slowly but surely making progress on the book project, is to then look at how, and I've written about this in some other contexts that I've published, but then how those neighborhood appraisals at that very important time then really set the stage for future development. And many of those redlined areas, then their extent of land use became very much industrial, and that contributed to then them becoming sites of heightened environmental health threats, and also poor flood protections and food insecurity and toxic exposures. And then also, according to some analyses, greater likelihood of exposure to sea level rise with climate change. And so that history, right, we think it's gone, but we still live it, and we see, right, how it's important today. And so that's something I'm really concerned with. And in my dissertation, I had looked at, and I'm more systematically kind of revisiting these analyses, but then how groups responded to it. So I did a lot of interviews, and how folks chose what kind of threat to mobilize against when there's so many that they're facing. And one thing that keeps coming up is how salient that racial history and exclusion continues to be, and how they think about the problem, how they seek to organize, and the types of solutions that they want to pursue. That's just the continuing significance of race is always there, it seems like.
Yep. So Raoul, we've come to the end of our time. Thank you so much for talking to us about your very interesting and important work. And I'm especially want to emphasize that last point you made about the enduring implications of history on the present. I think this is one of the many reasons why studying the humanities and the humanistic social sciences is so crucial. We have to uncover and recover that history to understand where we are and where we might go. Yeah. Good luck on that book project. It sounds completely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
I've been speaking with Raoul Lievanos, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Oregon. Thanks, as always, for watching.